On today's episode of Dance Med Spotlight, I'm speaking with Dr. Natasha Trujillo. She is a counseling and sports psychologist located here in Colorado. She works with lots of different teams and organizations all the way up to the professional level, including groups like the Colorado Ballet. In the episode, we talk about a variety of areas that apply specifically to dancers, but also have overlaps maybe with other types of athletes and other realms of just being a human, which, like we've talked about in some previous episodes, dancers are humans first. So a lot of things that are going to apply to the different people listening to these episodes. The biggest thing really to kind of walk away with from this information in this episode is to get a little bit more information, awareness, and normalizing working with folks like sports psychologists to help you in your performance and help you in your development as a dancer. Please make sure to check out this episode. We talk about so many important ideas, things like performance psychology and how it can help you in your dance career, whatever that means to you, grief and loss in dance, eating disorders, and other things as well. I know I walked away with some really great information, and I hope you do as well. So please check out this episode. Welcome back to another episode of Dance Med Spotlight, where we talk about all things dance medicine and dance science. Today, my guest is Dr. Natasha Trujillo, a counseling and sports psychologist in private practice, but associated with a variety of different teams and organizations, which we'll get into a little bit more here in a moment. But welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, Tasha, one of the things that I always ask people as we get started with these conversations is what sort of got you to this point doing what you do and working with organizations like Colorado Ballet?
Yeah. So started off as an athlete. So if we go way back, I've always kind of been in competitive environments and really liked competing and pushing myself. And that interplay between the mind and body is obviously very important in sport. And so it was always kind of budding under the surface, but I was very interested in psych. And I honestly didn't think I could create a career in athletics with psychology. I didn't really know that it existed when I was younger. Yeah. So I started off in residential treatment for at-risk youth, which I loved. Super hard environment, very, very challenging in so many ways, but very rewarding. And that made me want to get my doctorate. And my initial goal was I want to change policy and I'm going to run a residential treatment facility. And so up to that point, I had done some university counseling centers and residential treatment. And then when I went to my doc program, my advisor was like, why aren't you working in athletics? And I was like, is that a career? Mm-hmm. So she connected me with a sports psychologist in the athletics department. I got my doc at Purdue, so that's where I was, and started working with him. And that was kind of it. So, and it's awesome because I can blend the clinical psychological stuff, which is super important to me. But then also the performance, right? Athletes and performers are people at the end of the day. And so it's been cool, so cool that I can build my career doing both of those things. And I bounced around a little bit, worked in college athletics for a while, then worked at an eating disorder facility for a while where I built a program for elite athletes with eating disorders, and then landed in private practice where now I get to kind of contract with different teams and different sports and different levels of play. And so the variety of people I get to work with now is much greater, which I love because it keeps things fresh. And yeah, it's super enjoyable. No regrets right now.
That's wonderful. Well, and I think one of the benefits of doing something like that, where you get to kind of have your hand in a lot of different worlds within the umbrella of psychology and counseling, is you can see the similarities and differences between different populations, different sports, and be able to carry over some of those things where sometimes, if we get like too in one tunnel of some sort, sometimes we forget about like borrowing from the other areas.
Yeah. Well, and I think that fits well. I mean, there are a variety. I don't work with all clinical issues, of course, but the wheelhouses that I tend to hang out in, there's a lot of overlap with athletics, and so it makes a lot of sense. But then they're also different enough that, you know, in a given day, I can be over here and then over here and then over here, and yeah, it just is rewarding for me. It kind of fills the need for me, and then also I think provides hopefully pretty good comprehensive care.
Yeah. So kind of continuing on that same vein, thinking about dancers and other like performers
Mhm.
versus other athletes. What's maybe something that is definitely a commonality between them? And then what's maybe something a bit more unique that you see working in the dance and performer world?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's helpful to kind of set the stage here just in terms of what clinical issues I typically work with the most. So I specialize
Mhm.
in grief and loss, eating disorders, trauma. I do a lot with anxiety, depressive disorders, perfectionism, and then sport and performance concerns. That's not to say I don't work with other issues, but that's kind of where I tend to hang out the most.
Mhm.
And so if I'm looking at the similarities, I see a lot, like there's a reason why those are the areas that I tend to focus on the most, because they show up kind of across the board, right? We're all human, so we're not going to get out of grief and loss. And I really look at those things in nuanced ways. So I'm not just talking death loss when I think grief. And so when you think about the life of an athlete or a performer, how many things do you lose or grieve, even in the course of one season?
Mhm.
So with a basketball player, it might be their starting position that they lose. From in the performance world, that might be casting. They might not get what they want. They might be second or third cast, and that is not what they are vying for. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of similarities in that way. I do think that there's quite a bit of overlap as far as, again, they're people first, and they are high achievers. They are drawn to wanting to be perfect, right, and striving for that. So there's a lot of perfectionism across the board, a lot of difficulty relaxing, uh, difficulty recovering, difficulty buying into things outside of just physical training that helps them
Mhm.
excel in their performance. So those are just that's not an exhaustive list by any means, but those are a few things. As far as differences go, I think the language that even that
Mm.
I have to use is very different. A lot of dancers don't use the word athlete to describe themselves, right? And although
Yeah.
they are incredibly athletic and they have to give themselves a little more credit there, artist, performer, dancer, right? Those are the words that they most associate with their identity. So I think
Mhm.
that is a really big difference. You can use athlete pretty much in any other sport domain, um, fairly universally.
Yeah.
Uh, and then the way that I talk about some of the concerns and some of the even sport psych techniques, right? Like even saying sport psych, dance is different, right? It is an art. It is
Yeah.
really sport. So of course there's a lot of athletic prowess in that. That can be a little bit more creative at times, a little bit more vulnerable uh,
Mhm.
than other sports. Not to say sports don't have those things too, but I think there's just some cultural differences there too.
Mhm. And I think it's interesting that idea of like sport versus art. Do they have to be separate categories? Can there be some blending of them?
Yeah.
And, you know, like I'm involved in some different groups on Facebook, for example, that are dance teacher groups or
Okay.
studio owner groups. And there's sometimes this debate of like people want to call it a sport and but it's an art, it's not a sport, or people saying, but we are athletes and needing to do that. And so yeah, it continues to be a debate even within the dance world of what terminology is most appropriate.
For sure. Yeah. And I think I have to really up my game as far as examples that I use too. Because I'm not an expert on every single sport or performance and know all the ins and outs, but I try to pick up on the language and I try to come up with examples and, different analogies or metaphors that are sport or performance specific for people. So that's continuing ed, I guess we'll call it, that I have to do with myself because I want the message can be really important, but if I'm talking to a dancer and I'm using a football example, they might be like, what?
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
and part of that just goes to knowing who your clients are and what are their other interests. What else do they know? Because often, I mean, you could also have a dancer that's like, yeah, I totally get that. Let's talk
Mhm.
football. So, uh,
Mhm.
yeah, I try to be on top of that, make sure I meet each client where they are so they understand what I'm saying.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah,
important.
it certainly is. Going back to something that you already kind of touched on a little bit is this idea of grief and loss in dance and what that might look like for a dancer or a performer. You already gave the example of like maybe they didn't get cast in the role that they wanted. What might be some other examples that we would see in the dance world?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I can just go off my conversations this week,
Hmm.
right? So, of course, you have death losses because we are humans. We are not immune to those things. Um, the Colorado Ballet, in particular, had the death of a staff member this year, right?
Yeah.
That we've had to deal with. So, uh, death is obviously up there. There are also things, I think, competing at that level, right? And having your career and your life be so focused around your career, you do have to sacrifice things. And so people often don't get to travel to family events or see friends when they want to. And yeah, schedule is often dictated by rehearsals and by performances and that sort of thing. So there can be a lot of loss and accompanying grief processes with that too.
Hmm.
Um, we talked about casting already, but I also think promotions is a big deal too. If you don't get promoted,
Yeah.
if you don't get certain roles that you want, perhaps they're dream roles. So I think that really plays a role. Injuries play a huge role.
Hmm.
And we talk about that a lot because there's different phases of that too, right? How severe is the injury? At what point in the season does it happen? Because it's
Yeah.
a little different, right? Again, in the sport of basketball, I'm using that as that's what I played, so I use basketball a lot. But in that sport, you know, you have your season and you have X amount of games, and you
Hmm.
don't know what's going to happen in each game, but you know you're going to play a basketball game. In a ballet season, you have what 5 or 6 different performances, can be very different ballets. The rules you get can be very different, and so there can be a lot of grief and loss with injuries, just pending when that happens and what that means for recovery and for what the season has in store for people.
Hmm. I've also seen a lot working with some of the young dancers that I work with, where it's, even as they approach their last competition for the season, or maybe it's their senior year of high school and it's their final show,
Yep.
or, things like that. Even if they're continuing on to other dance or, like
Yes.
things are continuing sort of as they have been, but there's just something is coming to an end.
Yes.
Sometimes that can be really tough for them too.
Yeah, and every season you're going to have that. You're going to have people who don't get rehired or choose to do something different, and that is a there can be huge loss in that. Relationships, social and interpersonal stuff. There can be a ton
Mhm.
of grief and loss in that throughout the course of a season
Mhm.
as well too. So I mean, if you really look at it, uh, in life you can't have beauty without pain. You can't have love without loss. And so when you think about performance and when you think about sport, the grief is it's kind of everywhere when you look around. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of beauty and there's a lot of success as well, but you know, it's a gains and losses sort of approach that I think is really important for people to understand and to help kind of normalize and support dancers and performers and athletes uh, in life too, not just in their pursuit.
Yeah. One thing that it makes me think of also is, going back to the idea of injury for dancers where, like I still remember one of my clients from a while back who had gotten injured and it was a pretty significant injury. So she was out for
Okay.
months, and it was leading up to a big show season. It was, her junior or senior year of high school, so very important timelines around all of it, and she just had a lot of complex stuff going on, and when I was kind of talking to her of just like, how are you handling all of this and how else can I support you outside of just the physical stuff and the
Mhm.
recovery piece? Dance was so much a part of her identity. It was like she didn't know who she was or what she was going to do with her time.
Yeah,
And so even spending some time with her talking about, well, what other things do you like to do? Do you like to draw? Do you like to,
right.
let's talk about what you enjoy and try to help her see that like, oh, there are other things that you
Yep,
can be
yep.
doing during this time. But that was just a really like it was an interesting conversation because it had just never come up quite that obviously before with me.
Yeah. Well, and oftentimes people don't know, right? You ask, what else do you like? When I retired from sport, and you could almost see two people trip over themselves a little bit because their first question, they were going to say, "How's ball? How are you doing?" And then they're like, "Oh, but we don't know what else to ask." And I was like, "Yeah, me neither.
Mhm.
I don't know what else I like to do." So,
Yeah.
and I think that's a huge part of the work that I do is helping people recognize, of course, their their pursuit, their passion is important, but it's not the only part of who they are. And I would
Mhm.
rather them know that before a serious injury happens, because then you're also away from it. You're taking time off. You're seeing everyone else still get to train and perform and do what they want to do. And man, that is really, really hard if you don't have anything else to fall back on.
For people who well, because you just said, it's good if people can kind of identify some of those things before they sort of have to when they're
Mhm.
put in that position. What are maybe some things that you would suggest for somebody of like how to even explore that idea for themselves?
Yeah. Well, I think explore is a great word for it. You got to get out there, right? You truly have to recognize that things like rest and recovery and time away from whatever your passion is help you become a better performer. You are going to do well if you have a little bit more diversity in your life and you have more to fall back on. So I encourage exploration. I also encourage, which is really challenging, but I do encourage people try to find a support system and friends outside of your sport or performance domain.
Mm.
Now, just the sheer amount of time that people spend, it's really hard to do that. Um, but it's really important, and I encourage people to kind of take risks and expose themselves in that way to other groups, other ideas, just other events and ways to pass the time.
Mhm. I think that's really important too, thinking of, some of the younger dancers that I work with who are still maybe in high school or something like that. Um, some of them are in vocational or conservatory type programs for dance where they're doing dance even during the day, and then maybe they're doing online high school or something like that. And so it even limits some of their exposure at school to make friends and have other connections and that sort of thing. And so you know, they really have to put in some extra effort to make some of
Yes.
those connections.
Yeah. Well, and I think that can be really challenging too. And oftentimes I'm met with a little kind of like deer in the headlights. Sometimes you're like, no, I can't not put this amount of time and effort into it because if I hadn't done that my whole life, I wouldn't be here. So I can't stop now.
Mhm.
And that's a hard belief to kind of disentangle because, of course, right? It's and they're not wrong, but it's just a bit of a double-edged sword, right? You still have
Mhm.
to have a strong work ethic and be dedicated and make sacrifices and show up and work hard. And you have to recognize that you are human too, and you got to give yourself space to do other things.
Mhm.
But oftentimes, and again, the culture in some of these environments would not agree. Not that they wouldn't agree with what I'm saying, but it might not be as big of a priority
Mhm.
to really push it.
It is very common for, dance is a dancer's life. And so they are dancing multiple days a week, multiple hours a day. One of the things that we always say from the physical therapy standpoint and, physical health piece is young dancers shouldn't dance more hours per week than they are years old. So if they're 10 years old, don't dance more than 10 hours or something like that. But I can't tell you how many dancers
Oh,
I have in their teams that are dancing 20 plus hours a week.
yeah. Yep.
And so, yeah, having that conversation is
Yes.
a challenging one.
Yes. And trying to help people understand too that there is more when you are sleeping, like that is a form of your training. That is part of your training plan. Your nutrition, making sure that that is where it needs to be. If you your mental health, that is part of your training plan. If you see a physical therapist, that is part of your training plan. So it isn't just the time spent in class or rehearsals, right? It is also the work that you put in outside of that. And part of that is filling up your cup in other ways. It is social, it is emotional, it is psychological, etc.
Mhm. One of the things I've even found as a dancer, since I still dance and still compete and all of that, like I do a style of dance called West Coast Swing. And it's something where it's a very social thing. And there's a really big community here in Colorado for people to go and do it. So there have been times where I've been out 5 nights a week dancing and practicing and hanging out with friends. And then there's times where just other things in life have kept me away for weeks, if not months. And it's been fascinating when I've had those longer periods away where I might not even be doing any dance training, period, much less swing specific stuff. But I'll come back and more often than not, I'll dance with somebody who I often have danced with. And they go, "Oh, what have you been working on lately? Like, I can tell you've really been practicing." And I just go, "No, I haven't been dancing at all. I haven't even been thinking about it half the time." But it's just having that break away. It's like, it does something good to do that every once in a while, I think.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. I even think about just getting your body in kind of an optimal performing state too. I one thing that I have pushed a little bit more as I've entered Colorado Ballet and more dance spaces is the importance of cross training. So yes, you got to go to class, you got to go to rehearsals, but what do you do for strength? You know,
Mhm.
what are you doing for cardio in other ways? What are you doing again, just to like use different muscle groups and get your body moving in another way? I think that also can really help with some of the rigidity and obsessiveness that can show up in a lot of dancers too, because you do
Mhm.
want to make sure that you are again just diversifying what you do so that it doesn't get old and you can stay sharp and that your body is built and is strong enough to do what you need it to do.
Mhm. I think this ties in nicely to, kind of shifting gears a little bit, but this idea of like performance psych in dance.
Mm,
What does that mean for people who aren't familiar with that terminology?
yeah, yeah. So when I think performance psych, I oftentimes think about what are these skills and tools that will help someone bring out their best performance.
Mhm.
So that can be a lot of different things. My head usually goes to mental skills and more perfect performance enhancement stuff first. So things like self talk, goal setting, visualization, or guided imagery, um, goal orientations, um, goodness, all the reset and refocus mechanisms. So sometimes it's like, what are those small skills that you can use in and out of practice to help you with focus and concentration and be ready and locked in to perform the way that you want to
Mhm.
when it is your moment.
One of the things that immediately came to mind as you were talking about that is a talk that I attended at the last IADAMS conference. So, for people who don't know IADAMS, it's the International Association for Dance Medicine and Science, IADAMS for short. And there was a presentation by a really wonderful panel that was talking about the prevalence and neurodivergence in dance. And so, just kind of thinking also where, like, when you were talking about attention and focus or things like that, that may come up in different areas of the neurodivergence realm, even more particularly, that was just kind of like a little like, ooh, yeah, these things link.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's something that I feel really passionate about as far as the intersection between mental health and performance psych, because sure, you can teach mental skills, right? But it's so important that you kind of understand more about who each person is. So if you're trying to teach concentration or focus or visualization, but you're also working with someone who is neurodivergent in some way, let's say they have ADHD, for example, you might have to take a different approach. And so being informed, that's one of the best decisions I think I've made in my career, is I have the mental health training first and sports second, so that I can understand those nuances and how people learn and how people show up and kind of what they've been through when they walk into space with me. And then I can kind of form through, what sort of performance skills can we really work on, and what is the approach to making them effective for each person.
I think some of those ideas are also really important for people who are, whether they're dance teachers, artistic directors, anyone who's sort of guiding or training the dancers to understand, because, a lot of times people who teach or train something, it's very easy to do it in the same way that you learned it.
Yeah.
Or do it in the same way that has worked for you as you learned it. And so figuring out other techniques to then work with a variety of people that come through the door, and not just doing what you're already familiar with.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why it's so important to understand the culture and the context of the individuals that you're working with, right? What is their environment like, and what is the history of that environment too? Because some of my ideas, right, I have to be careful about how I bring them up and what that looks like, because I'm coming at it from a mental health perspective without knowing decades and decades of history of what it means to be a dancer, what it means to be a professional ballerina.
Mm-hmm.
So that is super important, because you have to understand that context when you're figuring out, how do I start to intervene, and how do I work to change the culture for the better too.
Yeah, that's a really important point, is, we all have to figure out how to work with each other and support each other as we're doing all of this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Shifting gears a bit again. So kind of some of the major areas of work that you do. We've talked about grief and loss. We've talked a little bit about the performance psych stuff. You also have the background working with eating disorders. What are some things that you've maybe seen more specifically within the dance performance space?
Yes. And I have to be careful to not generalize too much, and know that I've really been in the dance space for the, I guess, going on a few years now.
Mm-hmm.
But disordered eating is part of the culture. And that is a challenge, especially when I come in and I'm like, let's talk about this, right? So it's common. I mean, I think that's one of the most important points to make. It is common. It is more common than people think. And it does need to be addressed, because, again, something that's really challenging about eating disorders is how much they also affect our physical bodies, right? With depression, anxiety, other mental disorders, you don't necessarily see the physicality of it in the same way that you can with an eating disorder. And I'm talking all eating disorders here, not oftentimes people assume that athletes or performers only have anorexia, for example.
Right.
Full spectrum, right? So I think normalizing it and just kind of naming that it exists is super important. Dance is also a bit unique from other sport domains in that it can be very vulnerable, and outfits, costumes, right? The way that you use your body can be very vulnerable and very different than other sport types. And so that can create a lot of body image distress and a lot of self-consciousness, a lot of second guessing, and a lot of, when taken to the extremes, behaviors to try to modify or control body size and shape in a way that is not useful.
One of the things that also came up at that last conference that was an interesting one and made me change some stuff at my office is even the idea of, with dance, it is basically the norm that all of our training and practice is also done in front of a mirror.
Yes.
And so, this was coming from somebody who's a strength and conditioning coach, and saying how he purposely has areas in their gym space that have no mirrors
Yes.
so that the dancer doesn't have to look at themselves or isn't, sort of drawn to look at themselves in the mirror.
Yes.
But it also helps uptrain proprioception and body awareness and all of that of just what does it feel like in your body and not
Yes.
having to see it.
Yes.
But that was a really interesting point that he had brought up as well. Even being a dancer and growing up in those spaces that were always full of mirrors,
It's huge.
I hadn't
Yeah.
specifically thought about it like that.
Yeah. And that is a bit unique to dance, right? Soccer, football, baseball. You don't have mirrors out there watching stuff. Sure, you watch a lot of film, so there's opportunities for that. But right, dancers are spending six hours a day in front of a mirror looking at
Mm-hmm.
themselves. So yes, right, that does need to be talked about and addressed. And yeah, it's always my favorite time where they close the curtains and do the run throughs, because I think that just it's hard for even the healthiest of people to sit and watch yourself all day long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I immediately, once I came back, I ordered some curtains and curtain rods, and the mirrors that I have in my gym space put curtains up so that I can have them open or closed depending on what it is we're trying to work on or
Wow.
that sort of thing. But yeah, that was like my first purchase coming back.
Yeah, yeah. When I even think about this, kind of connects back to the grief and loss piece too, and body image and that intersection. But depending from dance to dance or from ballet to ballet, what costumes look like, what roles are, even the type of dance that you're doing, all of those things can really affect body image as well. And so we can almost see trends, and
Mm,
see how people are coping and what behaviors or thoughts of behaviors pop up more pending some of those cultural factors going on.
that would
Super
be
cool.
really
I
interesting.
give the Colorado Ballet huge props for this, but we just recently had costumes come out for one of the dances for our final performance, and there was everywhere there was talk. I probably can't eat for the next couple weeks, right? A lot of just kind of jokes or offhanded comments, but there's some seriousness to a lot of that stuff too. And
Mhm.
so we talked about it, and adjustments were made to make dancers feel a bit more comfortable, a little bit less revealing, and not perpetuate some of those thoughts and behaviors. So serious props to how that was handled. But yeah,
That's
I think it
amazing.
is rampant and a huge issue. And if we can kind of catch that and work to change and not just normalize that culture, I think we're going to be in a pretty good position. We didn't
Mhm.
talk about this either, but another thing that comes up here is just orthorexia, which is a focus on clean eating and
Yeah.
healthy eating. So a lot of categorization. You have good foods, you have bad foods, and I see that that's universal across the board in sport and performance. But and each culture looks a little bit different, right? Cross country might look a little bit different than volleyball, might look a little bit different from ballet. Also depends on who's in that space at the time.
Mhm.
But I think that's worth mentioning and pointing out too, is the sense of, oh, I can't have this, or I can't do this, or I can only do this. Those sorts of really strong and rigid rules.
Mhm. I've seen a lot of that discussion from some of the dietitians that are
Yeah.
dance specific folks of,
Yes.
yes, you can have that piece of pizza. It's not bad food. It still has nutrients. It still has things that are good for your body and, sort of de-villainizing some
Mhm.
of the foods that, you hear so much about sometimes.
Yeah. Yep. And that's something I love about the work that I do, is I get to be part of a collaborative team, right? So if I am working with a dancer who has an eating disorder, there's often usually a dietitian on board, a primary care provider on board, physical therapist on board, so that we're all kind of coming at it from our area of expertise, and providing a good continuum of care, and making sure that all parts of who they are being addressed to get them healthy.
For people who are around the dancers, whether it's parents or other family members, the teachers that are working with them, studio owners, artistic directors, all of these other folks, what might be some things, sort of some of the signs of eating disorders or disordered eating that you might see for a dancer or performer?
Great question. I think one of the biggest things is preoccupation with food and or weight. So paying attention to their language, right? And it kind of going back to what we just said. Oh, I can only eat that. No, I can't have that. So how are they thinking about food? How do they act around food? And is it markedly different from how they used to show up? Because it could be, and for a while, right, a dancer has a really great, healthy relationship with food, and then all of a sudden you notice that they're starting to cut things out or say, oh no, I can't have this, or oh no, I'm too fat. So recognizing what their language is and how they're acting around food is big. And if you're noticing that preoccupation where it's just taking up way more time and space than it might need to, I think that's a pretty good indication. One thing that I try to stray away from is using how somebody looks to assess whether or not they have an eating disorder. The fact of the matter is eating disorders look like every body type. And again, there's a range of eating disorders. We're not talking about just one kind. And so I really encourage people, if you're noticing something with them around food, or even just their personalities, maybe they are a little bit more isolated or withdrawn. Maybe they are a little bit more anxious and ramped up. Those things is what you'd want to talk about and kind of draw out in conversation, not any focus on the physical presence themselves, because I think that perpetuates certain stereotypes or messages about what is healthy, not healthy, expected, not expected, and can be really damaging. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had about coaches or ballet teachers saying X about body size, body shape, and how that has led to problems over time.
So we've talked a little bit about like things that we might see related to eating disorders. What are some things? Let's see, let me rephrase. What would be a good time to recommend somebody work with somebody like you as a dancer?
Yeah. Okay, so we talk about this a lot. Some of this depends on the strength of the relationship that you have with a certain dancer. And it's much harder if you don't know them all that well, because it's also hard to pick up on signs and symptoms. Like, is this different? Or is this how they've always been? Is it problematic? Sometimes you just don't know. So I think one of the biggest parts is just recognizing you don't need to have all the answers, and that's okay if you don't have solutions either. But I think coming at it from a supportive stance, and if you're seeing someone who you can see struggling or you don't think is reaching their potential, again, kind of normalizing this idea of, sure, you're coming to class, you're coming to rehearsals, but your mental health is also part of your training plan and how you become a better dancer. Your nutrition is also part of how you become a better dancer. So that's kind of how you can ease into that and open that up and just make space to talk about how to get connected. And I think, so I mentioned too, just noticing those differences and those changes. I also think it can come from other people in the environment. Sometimes parents might say, hey, this is what I'm noticing, and I think it's problematic. Are you seeing this in class? And even if you're not, that might be a good segue. If you have other dancers talking about somebody and saying, I'm worried about this person, I think something is up, I think that can oftentimes be a really important time to make that connection and try to encourage some support in a meeting with somebody like myself.
I know sometimes when the discussion comes up of, sports psych, sometimes people just hear the psych part and then they go, oh no, like, what do you think is wrong with me? Or, whatever. A lot of things can come with that sometimes.
Yeah.
What would you say to kind of like make that a little bit more friendly of a thing where people hear that and they just have that like panic moment of, what does this mean?
Yeah. So performance language, right? I think that is really important Can this be someone who is part of your team, very similar to a strength and conditioning coach or a physical therapist, right? Just someone who is aiding the work that we are already doing in the mental realm of things.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I can't tell you, even when I first started in college athletics, really knowing, you kind of have to get a vibe for each coach and kind of feel out, okay, how on board are they with mental health? Because language then becomes really important with how you talk about it, how you encourage it. I'll also say, though, that starts from the top up. If you have somebody at the top and your administration is very open and engaged and wanting to focus on mental health and sees it as a valid part of a dancer's entire training plan,
Mm-hmm.
much easier to have those conversations and quite helpful. So yeah, I try to kind of keep it with some of that performance talk. I also, and I'm stealing this from my advisor at Purdue, my mentor in the sports psychology field, but he always tells people, because psychologists, psychiatrists have this shrink, right? People will call shrinks.
Mm-hmm.
And so he will always, I'll never forget it. We were talking to, I believe it was the football team. This was my first year in training with him. And he said, look, we can laugh about calling us shrinks, etc., but I'm here to make you stretch, not to make you shrink. And I use that all the time.
I love that.
Because I'm not here to analyze. I'm not here, like, I want to form a good, solid relationship with somebody built on trust and built on safety. And I want to help you be the best version of yourself. So that is helping you stretch. That is not making you smaller. So I use that metaphor and encourage other people to use similar sort of ideas when they're talking to people about it.
I think it's also so important that with all of these different topics, with so many of the different professions that are out there to support dancers and performers and athletes, is just sort of normalizing all of it as well. I know sometimes as a physical therapist, people sometimes don't want people to know that they're going to physical therapy because it means that they're injured, or maybe they're going to get injured again sometime and like they're not now a reliable hire, or who knows what. There's a lot that can go into all of it. But like normalizing that people do benefit from these other resources and working with professionals. Normalizing that it can even be, something that is just, like you were saying earlier, part of the training, where like I love when I see dancers who aren't just coming to me because they've had pain or injury. They want to get stronger. They want to make sure they're on a good path for themselves.
Yes.
And that sort of thing. And so it's like, come see me before there's a problem.
For
And
sure.
I would love to work with you as well. And so like also recognizing that that is an option, and you
Yes.
just don't have to wait until there is a quote unquote problem to
Yes.
go work with somebody.
Oh, for sure. And I think that happens in our field all the time too, right? Where people are like, yeah, I'd be interested in, building on my strengths, or I'd be interested in figuring out how I can do better, but I don't have a real problem right now. It's like, you're a human, therefore you qualify.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to have your life falling apart in order to reach out and to make that connection. And I mean, I work with a fair amount of dancers who are in a really good place right now and are continuing to just kind of use this space to talk through how they can build on what they're already good at, and just make sure that they keep that sharp edge that they need in all areas of their life, not just performance. I also think too, I actually use physical therapy a lot in this explanation that I give people. But I will often say, if you tear your ACL, you're going to go to a physical therapist. No questions asked. No one's going to look at it all weird. It's like, yeah, that's part of your training plan. So if you have some sort of emotional or mental injury, which we're humans, that's going to happen, why would you not go to a therapist for that too? And I know there's stigma, and of course we talk about that too, but I think normalizing that, because most people, when I say that, they're like, yeah, you make a good point. Stigma is usually the biggest argument. However, if they really want to excel and they really want to succeed and to reach their goals, use it. It's there for a reason.
And I think there's some benefit too of, if you're able to establish a relationship with whatever provider it is before you like really need them for something, it helps us as the provider too, because we know what the before was. We know what the baseline has been.
Yeah.
We've already established that rapport. So when something challenging comes along,
Yes.
we already know how to work with one another, and I know how to support you as a client and all of that kind of stuff versus trying to figure that out on top of everything else.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Well, that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier too, with how important it is to kind of have some established connections with dancers so that you can pick up on signs and symptoms of an eating disorder and that sort of thing too. Because if you don't know, and it's challenging, right? That takes time and effort, but it's
Mhm.
hard to know, is it always this person's speed to be staying late and coming early, and or is this different, right? Like, is it changing? And even for those people who are doing that, is that healthy? Even if it is their speed, is it in their best interest to keep doing it? Because just because you can do something doesn't mean you should all the time. Yeah.
Yes, that's an important one.
Yeah. Yes.
So at this point, I think this is a good opportunity for a special segment on the show. We have the final bow. This is basically the take home message. We've talked about a lot of different topics, lots of different things that people can take away from it. But if you hope that one message comes across to somebody, what do you hope that that is?
Oh, good question. If I could sum up a lot of what we're saying today, I think one of the biggest messages is just the importance of looking at all aspects of your life as an important part of your training and your pursuit of whatever your passion is. And mental health needs to be part of that discussion. So, when you are pushing your body to the brink, know that that is also pushing your mind and your emotions, and you want to take care of that. You want to make sure that you're hitting all points and giving yourself the best shot.
I love that. Then, certainly not the least of what to discuss here, your opportunity for the shameless plug. So, this is your chance to talk about anything you have going on, anything that you want to promote, how people can find you. So, have at it.
Awesome. Yeah. So I am in Denver, but I'm licensed in over 40 states. So I work pretty much all over the country. Both, of course, as we've established in mental health and sports psychology domains. I work with a lot of individual athletes, and then, of course, teams and organizations too. We can do some consultation, we can do some education, we can do some one-on-one or group stuff too. Best way to contact me would probably be my website, I would imagine. And then, of course, social media. You can follow me on there too. And I try to have a nice mix of giving you some insight into what's going on in my practice, but also educational content, cultural content, that sort of thing too. And then I guess the biggest piece of this is I am publishing a book this month. So, yes. So, this is my first book. It's called And She Was Never the Same Again. It's a multi-generational memoir focused on grief and loss. So it really helps people understand the nuances of grief and loss, not just death loss, but all kinds. So there's a chapter on perfectionism. There's a chapter on athletics. There's a chapter of course, death and dying is part of that, but even just life transitions, medical decline as we age, that sort of thing. So the book, the website is andshewasneverthesameagain.com. And yeah, it's going to be out this month. So very excited for that.
Amazing. Well, I will make sure to tag all the different things and all of the different posts so people can have an even easier time to find you. But thank you so much for your time today. It was great getting to chat.
Yeah, thank you so much.